In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the trends of media ownership and control. So we're going to be looking at how the ownership of the media has changed over time and the impact that's had on the media itself. We're also going to be looking at different types of media ownership, which is going to bring up a lot of new key terminology that you do need to learn. And then finally, we're going to look at the theories of media ownership and whether or not the current trends are a good thing for the media or whether or not they're a bad thing for the media. So again, as we go through this lecture, there is going to be a lot of new terminology for you to learn. Please check out the transcripts in order to check spelling, just in case it doesn't quite come across in my vocalization. So we're going to start off by looking at the trends in media ownership. And Bagdigayan, I have no idea if I pronounced that correct, points out that in 1983 there were 50 media corporations that controlled the news media of the USA. So that's 50 companies, 50 different companies who were producing the news media in the US. By 1992, that had reduced to 22. So we've now got 22 companies who own and operated 90% of the USA mass media, controlling almost all their newspapers, magazines, TV, radio station, books, records, movies, videos, excuse me, photo services, all of it. Bagden argues that if the USA's media were owned by separate individuals, there would have been around 25,000 owners at this point. However, by 2017, this had reduced even further to 6 corporations. And you can see those major corporations on the board. Now, that's not to say there aren't other media outlets. There are smaller regional state level media outlets, but the majority of media ownership in the USA today is 6 companies: Comcast, Disney, 21st Century Fox, Time Warner, Viacom, and CBS. So with underneath, these are kind of like umbrella companies that own a number of subsidiaries which we might recognize as separate entities, but actually come under those umbrellas. For example, with Disney, who own Marvel, Pixar, and National Geographic. Time Warner owning Warner Brothers, but also HBO. So although there are these 6 corporations, within those corporations are a multitude of different companies. So what we're seeing is not the collapse of media ownership, but the concentration of media ownership. And internet providers, social media networking sites, content of digital media are increasingly being bought up by these companies to consolidate on the media, on their ownership. But if we look at the British media, and in particular British newspapers, Curran talks about newspaper industry, and that's Curran, Curran. He suggests that there has been a similar concentration of ownership in British newspaper industry since early 20th century. In 1937, the 4 press barons, as they were called, Lord Beaverbrook, Lord Rothermere, Lord Camrose, and Lord Northcliffe, owned 1 in every 2 national and local newspapers sold in the UK. And by 2015, this has changed very little. It has increased to 7 owners or 7 companies, but also these companies have diversified. So we have News Corp, which is owned and controlled by Rupert Murdoch and his family, and they can produce the Times, the Sun on Sunday, the Sunday Times, etc. You've got DMG, who own, was formerly owned by Lord Rothermere, and I think maybe owned by the current Lord Rothermere, who owns the Daily Mail, the Mail on Sunday, and the Metro, as well as 54 regional newspapers. So regional newspapers are things like the EDP. Northern and Shell are owned by Richard Desmond, and they produce the Daily Express, the Sunday Express, Daily Star, and OK Magazine. The London Evening Standard, the Independent, and the Independent on Sunday, the newspaper, are owned by the Lebdev Holdings Limited, Alexander Lebdev and his son Evgeny. I think that might be a little bit contentious at the moment as they are Russian. And the Barclays brothers own the Telegraph Group, which is the Daily Telegraph and the Sunday Telegraph. There are only two national newspaper groups who are controlled by companies rather than individuals, and that is the Trinity Mirror, who owns the Daily Mirror, Sunday People, the Daily Record, which is Scotland's biggest selling newspaper, as well as 150 regional newspapers, and the Guardian Media Group, who are controlled by a group of trustees, the Scott Trust, who own both the Guardian and the Observer. So although we have increased by 3 the press owners of the newspapers in the UK, that's still an awful lot of information being disseminated by a small group of people. Now, we do also have to look at British broadcasting. So this is going to be our TV and movie side of things. And again, we have a very small group of people here. Now, I'm not including the BBC on this because the BBC are not a commercial entity. The BBC are public broadcasting corporation. So they are run by a board of trustees, and they receive government funding for their programming. So they're not, that's why you don't have adverts on the BBC. So here we are talking about private ownership. So for terrestrial commercial TV, so this is non-satellite based, you've got ITV, Channel 4 and Channel 5. For satellite and cable in the UK, our major groups are Sky, Virgin Media and BT TV. Now, I've not included here streaming services because we'll talk about those separately later. So our TV and media, visual media in the UK, again, you've got 6 companies controlling what we see. Now, the BBC, as I said, is a public broadcasting corporation, so it doesn't come under this. But each of these companies own a multitude of channels. So, for example, ITV have ITVX, ITVB, ITV2. You've got Channel 4, you've got More 4. I can't remember the name of some of the others, but Channel 5 has 5 USA. And then on Sky, you've got Sky Movies. I believe Now TV is a subsidiary of Sky Now. So again, the ownership of media, who controls the media, is very much concentrated. Now, that could be a good thing and it could be a bad thing, and we'll look at that debate a little bit later. But their ownership isn't just of those channels. And what we need to look at now is the different types of media ownership. So how it is that these companies are able to exert so much control over what it is that we consume in terms of our media. Now, this is where we're going to get a lot of new terminology that you need to get your head around. The first one we're going to talk about is horizontal integration. So this is where the concentration of media ownership is consolidated into cross-media ownership. And this means that it's the bigger media companies often own a range of different types of media outlets. So they're not focusing on just one type of distribution. For example, News Corp, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, owns not only newspapers in Britain and Australia, but he also owns, or the group owns, HarperCollins, who are a publishing group. They also have the New York Post in the USA. Another example is that Fox TV and 21st Century Fox Film Studios also own a big chunk of other channels, Asian satellite channels. Now, Murdoch did try and buy Sky TV. However, because of the amount of information, the amount of media ownership he already has, that was blocked as seeing as creating a monopoly. So what we're talking about in terms of horizontal integration is owning a range of different type of media outlets: TV, radio, satellite, books, newspapers, magazines. So they're diversifying their distribution. The other way of looking at it is vertical integration. And this refers to the trend of media multinational companies controlling all levels of media production. So they're not just disseminating information or media products, they are involved in every step of their creation. For example, Time Warner not only distributes films and TV, it produces them, it creates them, it writes them, it films them. So they even own their own cinema complexes. Don't think they have them in the UK, but Time Warner is not only distributing media, they are also making media. News Corp also owns television and film studios, as well as satellite TV channels, for example, GB News. So what we're seeing is that vertical integration gives the media multinationals greater economic control over their operating environment. They have greater control of what they are disseminating because they are the ones who are creating it, and therefore they can shape their message. Disney similarly have vertical integration because they create their own outputs. Okay. You've then got what's called lateral expansion, and Virgin is a good example of this. So lateral expansion not only occurs when a media company diversifies into other areas of business to spread their economic risk. And Virgin is a good example of this. It's owned by Richard Branson, because not only are they a major media interest with music, publishing, films, cinemas, TV, and things like that, but Virgin also sells holidays, insurance. They run an airline, a train service, and even have healthcare. So Richard Branson has laterally expanded his business, his business interest. So if one of those areas fails or starts making a loss in any way, it's not too big of an issue because he's got lots of other areas he can gain his money from. Okay. The next one we're going to talk about is the global conglomeration. As I said, lots of big words here. So this is where media ownership has been helped by the breakdown of national borders and boundaries. So we're going back to that globalization that we've talked about previously in both terms of economics and in culture. Media companies such as Sony, Samsung, Viacom have invested in or brought up media companies outside of their origin. So all three of those are American-based companies. They started in America. However, they have now got headquarters all over the world and have bought up smaller media companies in the areas in which they are having a headquarters. So they will have a Hong Kong headquarters, a East Asian headquarters and Australian headquarters, as well as their US base, by which that they can build up their buy into those smaller media companies around the world. And globalization has opened up new international markets, particularly with new media such as internet and smartphones. So the concentration of media ownership has become global, with a small number of companies have transformed themselves into these global conglomerates which have headquarters and bases all over the world. And that has allowed them to monopolize their ownership into a diversity of media types and countries. Again, we can use News Corp as an example here, who has media companies in Europe, in Asia, in North America, in Australia, all over the world. Companies also go into synergy. And what synergy means is that media owners are increasingly strengthening their marketing by creating a diversity of packages to sell the same product. So they take one thing, for example, a film, and I'm using Marvel here as an example, and then they will sell the soundtrack. They will sell a game. They will sell comic books. They will sell action figures. They will sell clothing. So it's not just about creating the film anymore. It's also about creating all of the products that go with it. And you see that as well, not just with Marvel, which is a good example, but other companies such as Samsung and Apple, who are increasingly investing with and working with media film industry to create other products. And this has been brought about due to greater technological convergence and more accessibility to global audiences. Now, the third way, the final way, the sixth way that media companies can start creating monopolies and increasing their ownership is through technological convergence, referring to putting several technologies into one media delivery system, such as your smartphone, tablet, or laptop. And media owners are the concentration of media ownership in the past few years has created these simplified media delivery systems where you would have multiple products. Now you only have one. So you've got, again, companies such as Samsung, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, who are all working with media companies to bring around greater technological convergence. So you don't need to have multiple devices. Samsung TVs, for example, automatically come with YouTube, BBC iPlayer, Netflix, Disney, already installed on their devices. And that is through deals and contracts that they have with Samsung. So there are lots of ways, and a lot of media companies will utilize more than one of these types of media ownership. As we've seen, News Corp is both horizontal and vertical integration. They're also a global conglomerate. Okay, Disney has horizontal, vertical, and synergy. They also have lateral expansion because they have their theme parks. So media ownership won't just be one type. They will put their fingers in as many pies as they can in order to increase profits. Because remember, these are private companies and they are all about the profit, as we live in a capitalist society. But is this media ownership concentration such a good thing? Now, there are some theories who say yes and some that say no. So Gillian Doyle, whose work has focused on media ownership, says that the examination of media ownership and control is important for two reasons. One, all points of view need to be heard if a society is truly democratic, and how can that be offered when you have concentration of media ownership? And two, abuses of power and influence by elites need to be monitored by a free media. And if you only have a few owners or limited media ownership, can we really call that a free media? Now we're going to be looking at four theories of media ownership. Some who are going to argue that this limited media ownership is a good thing, some arguing that it is not. And the first one we're going to look at is the pluralists. Now, the pluralist view of media ownership states that your choice as a consumer is a big deal. And sociologists point out that the kind of shows, music, and articles that become popular are largely influenced by what people want to see and hear, and not by the views of the media owners. So media ownership is, media content is shaped by consumer demand, not by media ownership. And this doesn't just about television and music, it encompasses all areas of media, including blogs, podcasts, YouTube channels. It's a continuous cycle. We shape our media through the choices that we make. And you see this in trends as well, where all of a sudden you'll get a slew of TV shows, or a particular type of music will suddenly become popular because that is what people want. And the media, because they are private companies, they are going to put out what people want. An example is during the 1990s, there was a dance music craze. Early 2000s, it was more rap music, or pop music. TV shows, we had a whole slew of zombie TV shows, vampire and supernatural type TV shows that all came out around the same time. So when something becomes popular, the media will jump on that and start creating more of that, because that is what is popular and that is what is going to get people buying their products. So it's not linked. It doesn't matter that there is a limited number of media owners, because they are not the ones who are shaping media output. The pluralists also point out that there is a professional ethics system of checks and balances within the media, which are there to prevent too much control by one particular owner. Maintaining a level of responsibility and trustworthiness is crucial in the media landscape. In this sense, it's like a moral compass guiding the media companies to present facts, avoid misinformation, and respect diverse perspectives, because they are competing for media viewers and media consumers. So if they're only putting out one particular viewpoint, they're not going to attract that viewership. And we've seen this with Good Morning Britain, or not Good Morning Britain, or Great Britain News, the new Murdoch TV channel, where their viewership initially was quite high because people were interested. Oh, this is something new, I want to see what it is. And then they realized that it was only giving a very right-wing view. So people started turning off. They didn't want to listen to the likes of Lawrence Fox and Jacob Rees-Mogg, who were only giving one viewpoint. So there is a sense of professional ethics that if the media companies want consumers, they have to abide by those ethics. Okay, and this ethos encourages journalists and content creators to adhere to an unofficial code of conduct that promotes fairness and objectivity, building a media environment that people can trust and therefore will go back to. Now, it is unofficial. These are not legal guidelines. There are legal guidelines that the media have to follow, but what we're talking about, these professional ethics, are an unwritten code. The pluralists also argue that the media is an essential part of the democratic process. The media performs essential tools in democracy, giving everyone a space to voice their opinions and hear from others. It helps to foster open discussion and debate, representing a broad spectrum of views, which is healthy for a democratic society. Now, it could be argued that, or the pluralists claim, that the range of media products available is now so diverse that as a result, all points of view are catered for. If some points of view have greater range of media representing them, this is not necessarily biased, it's a mirror of what people want to see. So the media is acting as a mirror to society rather than shaping society. An example here was the majority of newspapers raised concerns about Jeremy Corbyn refusing to push the nuclear button, and the plural because he was anti-nuclear weaponry, and therefore were against him becoming Prime Minister. Pluralists would argue that the owners, editors and journalists were merely mirroring the concerns of the UK citizenry rather than shaping the UK system. The concentration of media ownership also is a product of economic rationality. And what we mean here is that running a media company, a media conglomerate, is not a small thing. It is huge and it involves considerable cost and resources. Making a TV show, making a movie, making music is expensive. So the pluralists would argue that having a few large entities owning multiple outlets, think your vertical and horizontal integration, is economically rational. Keeping it in-house keeps the costs low and therefore keeping operations financially viable. Think of it like a tree. You've got loads and loads of different branches but a single trunk. And that trunk is the media company, who is able to branch out into multiple areas because it has a strong foundation. So it's not a bad thing that the media ownership is small, because it means concentration of both production and distribution, which keeps costs low. And we as the consumer then benefit from these lower costs. They also point out about public service broadcasting such as the BBC. Now, I mentioned this earlier, that the BBC is not a private company. It is owned by the British public and it is paid for through our licensing fee. And the pluralists would argue that a significant share of the media market in the UK is taken up by the BBC, and its media outlets are controlled by the state but have a worldwide reputation of impartiality. The BBC is not allowed to be politically one way or the other. It is not allowed to promote one political party over another, even if they are in power. And therefore, they are able to cater for every conceivable taste and opinion. The BBC was set up in 1926 by a royal charter, which clearly states that the BBC has a legal obligation to provide specific services, i.e., to inform, to educate, and to entertain a full audience spectrum, meaning all groups in society. The government reviews of BBC output have consistently stressed the importance of impartiality in reporting of news and the catering for all segments of society. The pluralists believe that this sort of public service broadcasting is the epitome of impartiality and objectivity, and a counterweight to any bias that may come from the public sector. So as long as there is public service broadcasting, a concentration of media ownership doesn't matter, because we can always go to the impartiality of these public service broadcasting areas. And we do need to point out there are government and state controls of the media. The pluralists view the role of the government as not to dominate the media, but to facilitate a media landscape that encourages diversity, impartiality, and fairness. And it involves setting up rules that prevent misinformation, promote transparency, and foster a space where different media outlets can operate on a level playing field. So there are laws in place of things the media can and cannot do. For example, libel. The media cannot knowingly say something or publish anything that they know to be untrue or suspect to be untrue and may cause damage to somebody's reputation or a business's reputation. They have a responsibility to check what they are publishing. So these state controls mean, again, that the media owners actually cannot manipulate what it is that they are putting out there too much, because otherwise they will fall foul of government and state controls. Now, generally we can see that the pluralists are of the mind that concentrated media ownership is not a bad thing, because there are counterbalances through public service broadcasting and through government and state controls of the media that prevent a bias from occurring. However, not everyone agrees with them. Firstly, we have Curran, who says that media professionalism, that those ethics that we were talking about, can be undermined by a media owner. And he uses the example of journalists who, if they fail to toe the party line of the owner, they are putting their job at risk, because the owners of these companies could say, well, we don't like that sort of thing, you are not going to work for us. So journalists are having to deliberately censor their reports that may draw the owner's own attention, or may bring unwanted attention to them. You've got Blummer and Gurevich, again, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who state that there is an over-exaggeration, an overstating of the impartiality of journalists. Many journalists are over-reliant on official sources, such as the police, the government, people inside the things that they are reporting on. And you often hear it in the news where they will say things like, an inside source tells us. They won't tell you who that source is, but they will say that they've got an inside source. So therefore, they are over-reliant on these sources to give them information. And Trawler builds on this and says that sometimes that journalists become over-involved with their subjects. So think again, like when we talked about participant observations, where sociologists or researchers can go native, this can happen to Trawler. He observed that 500 journalists he observed that 500 journalists who were embedded with the British and American troops during the invasion of Iraq in the 1990s and 2000s resulted in a one-sided, rather unbalanced view of the conflict in Iraq. And many of these journalists formed personal attachments with the soldiers with whom they were embedded. They became too involved, so they were only showing one particular side, one particular view of the conflicts they were covering. Feminists would also criticize the pluralist view because they argue that the range of female voices available in the media is very few. When we looked at those media owners, all of them were men. Now, there may be women on their board of directors, there may be women in high-powered positions within these companies, but the owners were men. And therefore, they argue that media content is very male-orientated and media representation of women is very limited because they are placating those male owners. Thornham argues that all too often the feminist perspective, the female perspective, is dismissed by journalists because they are seen as extreme and threatening. And as we've said before, journalists don't want to rock the boat when it comes to the owners. And finally, it's argued that the media is actually a highly censored marketplace. It's not this free-for-all of free speech that the pluralists put forward. It's difficult for ordinary people to decide what to see and what to hear if the media provide their only source of information. Powerless groups do not have the resources to set up media companies. It costs a lot to set these companies up. So it can be argued that we are only really getting one view of situations from the media, and the media, this idea of choice is a false choice. We have lots of channels, we have lots of newspapers and things like that, but they're all coming from one source. So perhaps that choice isn't quite as choosy as we think it is. The next theory of media ownership we're going to look at is the Marxist view of media ownership. Okay, and as you can imagine, the Marxists are not particularly positive about the control of media ownership, and they scrutinize media's role in a capitalist society, typically coming from seeing it as a form of control and ideological dominance. So the first Marxist we're going to look at is Miliband. Ralph Miliband, who is the father of the politicians Ed and David Miliband, suggests that the media operates as an ideological state apparatus. Now, we've come across this term before by Althusser, and it means that they are disseminating the norms and values that the rest of society is living up to. They are controlling the narrative. And the media, therefore, is just not a source of information or entertainment. It's a powerful tool that is reinforcing social class division and capitalist ideology. Okay, so it's kind of like, to give you an example, during the Cold War, the media was very negative towards communism and directed public opinion in certain ways, and that was the way that the media owners wanted it to go. Curran has picked out multiple examples of the ideological state of the media. He talks about Berlusconi in Italy, a figure synonymous with media control. His reign saw a stark alteration in media narratives, paving the way for individual influence over public discourse. And the channels were airing content that largely favoured his perspectives and his political policies. So because he was although technically he gave up his media companies when he became a politician, The reality was he didn't really, so those media companies really were positive towards Berlusconi because he owned them. We can also look at the press barons in the 1920s, where individuals who used their media ownership to champion personal ideologies. This was a period where newspapers were often seen as propaganda tools rather than impartial news outlets. There was a lot of anti-feminist discussions during this time, very much against the suffragists, etc. And finally, you've got Rupert Murdoch since 2000. His media empire, spanning multiple continents, has often been criticised for fostering a kind of journalism that leads heavily towards sensationalism, with networks like Fox News steering narratives in discernible partisan directions. Murdoch was a fan of Trump. Fox News was a huge fan of Trump, and Trump could do no wrong, and still to a certain extent can't. So again, we're seeing how those owners have shaped media ownership. In 1997, Rupert Murdoch was on the side of Tony Blair, the Labour leader at the time during that election. And when Tony Blair won the election in 1997, the Sun newspaper ran a headline that said, "It was the Sun what won it," suggesting that the Sun newspaper, owned by Rupert Murdoch, manipulated their readership into voting for Tony Blair, when traditionally Sun readership is more conservative rather than Labour. At around the same time as Miliband was writing, you've got Castles and Cossacks, who suggest that the media is used to divide and rule the working class. And the media owners, because of this limited number of media owners, they are able to do this to maintain their power. Now, Marcuse uses the term bread and circuses, where media serves as a distraction to the realities of inequality and exploitation. So an example here could be going back to ancient times and thinking about the gladiator games of ancient Rome. Usually when there was some form of civil unrest or people were unhappy with things, the Roman Empire would put on gladiatorial games to distract people from their oppression and their discontent, which prevents them from rising up in revolution and overthrowing the powerful. So when you've got media ownership concentrated in a few very rich and powerful people, they are going to do everything they can in order to maintain that power and maintain that wealth. Finally, Tunstall and Palmer talk about how the government really don't want to control media owners. We see that a lot of these media owners often provide money and donate to politicians and owners and leaders, and therefore the government don't want to upset these guys because they want their money. They want them to donate to their election campaigns, and by donating to those election campaigns, they're kind of buying their way into controlling the narrative. Now, obviously, as with any theory, there is no particular one that is correct. So there are criticisms of this. The first is that a lot of the evidence that's suggested, like by Curran, for example, is anecdotal, meaning it's not systematically and scientifically collected. It's stories from journalists who've had stories quashed or been told to stay away from certain issues. So it is very anecdotal. So we cannot say for certain that media owners do control their outlets in that way. Secondly, Gramsci we can go back to the idea of dual consciousness, and it's kind of, I guess, a little bit rude really to suggest that we are so easily distracted by entertainment such as the gladiatorial games to forget about our oppression. So Gramsci argues that instead of creating a false consciousness, the audiences have a dual consciousness where they're saying, I get I'm exploited, I understand that, however, I kind of like it. Okay. And then we've also got Matheson, who talks about synoptic surveillance, and Manatel, who talk about surveillance. The rise of user-generated media is taking power away from these media owners. People are creating their own media. So therefore, this idea that the media owners are really creating the narrative is kind of like, well, not anymore. New media has changed this system. And instead of the media companies telling us what to think, they now have to worry about the audience controlling them. And we're still quite unclear. Are media owners' motivations profit or ideology? Are they making decisions because they want to divide and conquer and prevent revolution? Or are they making decisions because they just want money? And that has yet to be determined. Next, we have the Glasgow Media Group, who talk about unraveling media dynamics. And they argue that the media content doesn't support the interests of those who run the capitalist system. However, this is an unintended byproduct of the social backgrounds of journalists and broadcasters. So many of the journalists and the people who are involved in media creation come from very similar socioeconomic backgrounds as the media owners. So it's not an intentional thing that the content is supporting those people or that socioeconomic group. Is a byproduct because the people who are involved come from that socioeconomic background. So, for example, if you look at journalists and actors and actresses, they do tend to come from a middle class or above background. You could argue that there's nepotism involved, that it's connections that they have that get them into these positions. But invariably, they're going to reflect their own personal beliefs and values. And it's not intentional, it's just the fact that that's where they come from. And the decisions on what is, they are, the GUMG argue that the decisions on what content to put out isn't determined by the media owners' belief systems or their ideologies, but by economic pressures. As we've said before, media owners, these companies, are competing for our attention. They're competing for our business. So therefore, they need to put out what people want in order to make money. They can't do that if they're just saying, I'm going to put out what I want to see, what I think, what I want people to believe. And this links into this idea of agenda setting and cultural hegemony. The media doesn't just report on events, but plays a crucial role in deciding on what is worthy of being news, what is worthy of being part of our media. And they shape social discourse, they shape the agenda of what it is that we are discussing. For example, when Love Island is on, God, I hate that show. When Love Island is on, it's all in the media, it's all in the press, and everybody is talking about what's happening on Love Island. Is that giving the people what they want? Absolutely, because people are obsessed with that show. And when it comes to cultural hegemony, where the media subtly enforces a worldview of the dominant class, weaving into the cultural fabric through repeated narratives. So it's creating this cultural hegemony, this cultural sameness, by providing the same things. So the idea that the concentration of media ownership is a bad thing isn't. The Glasgow Media Group are kind of a little bit on the side of yes, because they are giving us a one-sided biased view. They just don't mean to. They are trying to make money in a capitalist system, and they are telling us what it is that we should be talking about and what we should be culturally interested in. Now, Jones refers to the establishment, and in this book, he unveils the complex web of establishments that steer economic and political narratives. Through this lens of there being an establishment, a core group, we see the media landscape deeply intertwined with power structures and often broadcasting content that mirrors the interests of those within powerful establishments, such as company owners, politicians, the government. And that doesn't necessarily, and that's tempered by some objectivity, but the majority of the messages we get are coming from what he refers to as the establishment, those in power, those in responsibility. Now, just with every other theory, there are criticisms of this. There are criticisms of the Glasgow Media Group and their views. First of all, it is considered very vague. It doesn't really identify what it considers to be an ideology and therefore what the effects of that ideology are. They tend to be more of a description than an explanation. They also focus on media professionals, ignoring a lot of the input from owners, but also from the consumer, especially in the age of new media, where consumers have a lot more power over what they consume and what messages are being sent out. Feminists would argue that the agenda setting that comes from the media is a form of patriarchal control, because those in power tend to be men who are there trying to maintain and control their power. And finally, as I've said before, new media and citizen journalists have the potential to counter the influence of what Jones referred to as the establishment. That establishment is now under as much scrutiny through synoptic surveillance and surveillance and citizen journalists as other people are. They're no longer stuck in their ivory towers looking down and determining what it is that we can have, because people are not fighting back, that's probably the wrong term, but people are kind of going, actually, you can't tell me to do these things when you're not to do these things when you're doing them yourselves. Rupert Murdoch, for example, has been hugely criticised for his views and his attitudes. Now, the postmodernists are our last theory of media ownership, and their general view is that media ownership doesn't really matter because of the nature of postmodern society. So, in a postmodern society, media ownership is very limited in its power because society is media saturated. We live in a world that media is integral to our lives. It influences every aspect of our lives, from the food we eat to the clothes we wear to what we consume in terms of broadcast media, music, books, or our media is just in every aspect of our lives. And there is absolutely no way media owners could influence everybody to that degree. If that were possible, we'd all be living exactly the same lives, and we're not. We also have to take into account globalization and the increasing consumer choice. It's opened the floodgates of choice for consumers, a choice in what they watch, where they watch, what they read, the perspectives they are going to look at, and a phenomena that has expanded the borders, the boundaries of media beyond comprehension, and in doing so has forced media owners' hands. That increased choice has meant increased competition. And another aspect of postmodern society is the breakdown of meta-narratives, meaning that media owners are no longer able to tell us this is the truth. Accept it. Because now we have access to information far more readily and are able to go, actually, that's your truth, because I found information over here that says something different. And there's more information here about a different viewpoint. So media owners are no longer able to shape the truth. Okay, they may try through editing, but they can't shape it because we can always find a different view. So in general, what the media, what the postmodernists are saying is that media owners may own a company, but they cannot shape the message. They are no longer in control of the media. And we've got Bourriard, who goes into this idea of hyperreality, where reality and fiction are seamlessly blended in the media space. And it can make it difficult to differentiate the real from the simulated. The example being scripted reality. TV shows such as Kardashians, such as Towie, Made in Chelsea, Love Island, all of these things are what's referred to as scripted reality. The situations are manipulated for entertainment value. But for many, it's hard for them to see the difference between what is reality and what is simulated. Trowler also talks about polysemic media messages. And what he means by that is that the messages that the media carries have lots of different meanings, and it's our experiences, our backgrounds, our knowledge, and our views which shape the messages we take from the media. So the media owners are not able to tell us this is the message, because we will all look at things in slightly different ways. For example, the Barbie movie that came out recently, fantastic film on the surface for entertainment value. You can just watch it as Barbie learning and evolving as a character. But within that, there is talk of patriarchy and matrifocalism. There is talk of feminist control. There is talk of what it means to be a woman in modern day society. But everyone who goes to see that film will take a different message away from it. And it's impossible for the media owners to control that message because it's too individualized. And finally, media owners can't control the fact that there is the blurring of line between producers and consumers. Levine talks about the rejection of messages, whereby people can actually say, the consumer can say, I don't agree with you. The consumer is becoming the producer. So if they don't like what they see, they're just going to go out and do it themselves. Or they're going to try and find somewhere else to get what they do want. So that leads us to the criticisms of postmodernism. And again, it's a vague set of anecdotes. There is no systematic scientific evidence to back any of this up. It's all anecdotal evidence, meaning we could just kind of say, well, it's just the experience of those who are doing the study. There is an exaggeration of the information explosion. We have more access to information, yes. But is that new information? Or is that just the same information repackaged and recycled and put in different language? It ignores the inequalities which do allow for powerless groups to access the media in a meaningful way. People are able to turn off their TVs if they don't like it. They are able to make choices in what media they are consuming. Okay, again, another long one. I apologize. So we've got the trends in media ownership and we've got the theories of media ownership.